It's another Friday Forum. It's actually a pop-up Friday Forum because this is a topic we're going to talk about today that is really top of people's minds. And I just want to welcome you. My name is Cindy McDonald. I'm a counselor, a business coach, and a producer. And these Friday Forums are conversations with experts in areas that we all care about. So I'm very proud and honored today to have as my guest, Jed Applerouth. And Jed's going to talk about the digital SAT and give us a new and other insights into what this means for us, for our students, and for education in general. So as you're logging in, can you put in your name and your location, and so that Jed can see where everybody is from? This is one of the things that sets my Friday Forums apart, is that you get to participate. Today, Carmen is not with me, unfortunately, so you guys will have to be patient. So if you have a question or things, go ahead and put them in the chat or put them in the Q&A, and Jen and I will address them as we go. So as we come in, everybody, we're so glad to have you here. You can see we've already got people coming in, and from Connecticut, glad to have you here, Maria, Elizabeth, Diana, Venezuela. So Jed, hopefully you can talk about things from an international perspective as well.
Sure. Happy
And
to.
I want to tell people a little bit about your background.
Yeah.
So some of you know Jed, you've met him, but he is the founder and the president of Applerouth Tutoring Services. It's a national test prep and academic tutoring services provider. I also noticed you're doing academic coaching as well on your website, that it offers that as well. Is that correct?
Executive functioning, coaching, we help students with, that kind of helping their grades be strong, helping them organize themselves. So all the APs, the high subjects, EF coaching, and then the testing. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's very important. And I see that I know many people offer that, and I see that as an upcoming thing as well. So just so you guys know, Jed is also a nationally certified counselor. He has a master's degree in professional counseling and a PhD in educational psychology. So he knows what he's talking about. And I remember, Jed, when you were working on all that, and the time and effort and angst that went into getting that PhD. Jed has researched testing for over 2 decades and has presented his findings at national conferences, published in numerous peer-reviewed journals. He is also, and I didn't know this, a trained landscape artist.
Yeah.
And I can't even pronounce this word.
Oh, the drum, a djembe.
It's a drum.
I bang on my drum with my kids, and I play my guitar. My little 1-year-old son loves me playing my guitar and plucking strings, and I start jamming on the drum, and then he starts moving and dancing. So yeah, I have fun at home with my little ones, my instruments.
That is the best thing of all. So you can see we've got Amy from New York, Monica has joined us from Switzerland, Marianne, Lisa in Southern California, Jeffrey, Jackie's here from Illinois. So we have, and Michelle from Houston, and I know Michelle and many people on here, and I know Michelle in particular, to help students with preparing for tests. So welcome. We're glad to have you here today.
Some friendly faces in there, people I know. It's cool.
Good. So tell us, I've given your bio, but tell us a little bit more about yourself.
About myself. Well,
how did you get into this? What prompted you to go into this field? It's not really
this field was completely an accident, totally not intentional, not what I expected. And I mentioned, the landscape art, the painting stuff. So my course, if you're going to track back a few years, college, I did international studies in business. I did the Huntsman program at Penn. And after that, I did a year doing AmeriCorps. So I went out to New Mexico and taught 5th grade, doing community service stuff with kids, 10-year-olds. I really enjoyed that for a year. Came back. I spent 2 years as a consultant for McKinsey Consulting. And I was flying around doing all kinds of things, operations and marketing. And I was a research analyst for them. After that, I decided I was going to get the heck out of corporate world, and I was going to just paint. And I was going to be a painter. And I started for about 6 months. I was selling my work. I was in some galleries, just doing landscapes. I wanted a total pivot. But after 6 months of painting, I was like, you know what? I need to pay for health insurance. I need some other revenue sources. One of my old mentors and engagement managers at McKinsey said, you know what? When I needed money, I did some tutoring. And for the SAT, and it's like I did pretty good on the SATs. So I said, let me try that. So I went back to my high school and I made a business card and a brochure, and I started with one student, and I was working in my house. And it turned out I was pretty good at it, at tutoring and stuff. And so I just began tutoring. Then my dance card got pretty full. And then I hired Natalie Henderson, who was the CEO of the company. And then we began, like, we got full, I began doing groups, the groups got full, began hiring others, and the whole thing just expanded. So the market said yes to my tutoring. My art was a little bit less of the happy reception, but I still love to paint for myself. And so the grand scheme, it was somewhat of an accident in my like late 20s. But when I was, I think, like 30, 31, 32, I said, you know what? This is not so much an accident. This is what I'm going to do. And so it went from being a stopgap measure to make some money to suddenly, no, let me actually apply the skills and, let me just, what can I accomplish with this? And I took the company and really grew it in multi-states. And but it was honestly, it was never intentional. This was always going to be a way, in the beginning, it was a way for me to pay for my art supplies and buy health insurance. But it was never going to be my career. But suddenly, 23 years later, whatever it is, yeah, it's a career.
I think that's true for many of us, is that
Yeah.
we just accidentally, find and explore. And these industries have, I mean, you helped grow the whole test prep industry, and from a much more personalized, customized perspective.
Yeah, I rode the wave of test prep. Like, it's funny, like Jeffrey Katzman in the 80s, you had Princeton, you had Stanley Kaplan, that was back from the 40s and 50s in New York and Brooklyn. Then the Katzman guy, came in the 80s, and the Princeton Review. And so it was a couple of big nationals. But I jumped in the space in 2001, and there really weren't that many small regional players, and it wasn't that really highly personalized and customized and boutique and tailored. And that was my model. And then that began to grow in the 2000s and 2010s. But I really did kind of come in at this time when the need was there, and because test prep really wasn't a big deal. Like I was in high school in '93, I knew one guy in my high school who did test preparation, my friend Jace. That was it. No one else did test prep. But then and then schools became more selective. Penn went from 35% acceptance rate down to 6. Things have changed, and they began to let in more international kids. The competitive dynamic shifted, and so test prep became a bigger piece. And I was part of that wave for sure. Timing on that.
So one of the things that you like and set you apart is knowing and understanding data.
Yeah.
So what are some different studies that have been done, like that you rely on or that you point to, that show the effectiveness of just testing in general?
Yeah. And testing, I mean, it's interesting as a society. We've seen different perceptions. What is the value of assessment? And during the early 2000s, No Child Left Behind, there was a big push for accountability. Let's make sure that we're not passing kids on without these requisite skills that they're going to need later on. Because grades, part of it, high school grades and grades in general, can be subjective, and there are pressures to not fail kids for a lot of reasons administratively, in terms of funding and other things. So let's make sure the kids know something. And so I've always looked at the big studies in terms of the PISA and the NAEP, and international studies, national studies, as well as you have these assessments, the college boards, SAT and the ACT, as a way of trying to figure out what do kids actually know in this narrowly defined range of skills of reading and math and grammar and writing skills and so forth. And looking at that, the college boards did lots to validate their own data, but everybody questioned their data. But what really I value heavily is when institutions themselves look at the data. Because the whole thing is, what's the point of an SAT? What's the point of an ACT? And it's to predict performance in college. I want to make sure that if I let a kid into my school, they're going to have the chops to handle the classes and the coursework. They're going to matriculate. They're going to actually persist. They're going to graduate, and they're going to maintain decent grades. And so what's the most meaningful is when you have schools who do the research and analysis and say, what is the correlation? And they're going to run the regression. They're going to plug in the ANOVA and try to figure out, does the SAT, is it a strong predictor What is the R squared? How much of a prediction do I get from the test score to the grades as a freshman, grades, 4-year GPA, and then graduation? Is this a strong predictor? And then compare that, you throw into the equation other pieces, other dependent values like, high school GPA, other factors. And the question is does the SAT create an independent contribution? Does it help predict with, greater strength? And if I throw in high school grades plus the testing, does it yield a better prediction? And the research coming out of many, many schools is absolutely yes, it does. It has independent value to predict performance in college for, GPA, 1 year, 4-year, and graduation rates. And like I looked to the University of California did a massive study. I read front to back, and it was like 200 pages, and it was so compelling that the faculty at UC said, they voted like 49-0 to maintain test requirements. But then I mentioned to you earlier, like the board, the board said we don't need more studies, we don't need more data. We are getting rid of testing permanently because we think it's a bad thing. We think it's unfair. We think it's racially motivated, independent of the data, which showed that no, this independently, this is a predictor, and especially for minority students. This helps, the ones who perform very, very well. We're trying to, maintain diversity. If you look at these tests, the kids who do really well in these tests, these are the kids who will do very well at UC. And so there's been this kind of unfair split between if, either you want diversity or testing, you can't have both. And that's just simply not true. And there are schools who use testing and they maintain diversity. MIT, they reinstated their testing requirement and they created the most diverse class in history. So to me, it's like, this is just a false dichotomy. But so looking at the MIT data, looking at, and for years, even like, I think it was Harvey Mudd, they required the SAT 2 for math because that was the most predictive of who will do well. But then there was all this pressure and then they dropped it and eventually the College Board killed the whole product line. But it's when schools look at their own data and say, like MIT found if, kids who do poorly on the SAT are the ones who fail out of MIT. And so it's like, this actually protects the kids from coming here and having to leave after a year. And so this test helps protect our students and maintain and choose the right students. So to me, it's that data. When I hear Jeremiah Quinlan over at Yale saying, looking at grades, looking at testing is the strongest predictor that we have, more so than high school grades. And that was part of Raj Chetty's research with Harvard and his colleague, I think it was over at Dartmouth. They were looking at this big data set of the Ivies Plus. So it was at Chicago, it was Duke, MIT, Stanford. And there was like, yeah, actually, grades have become much less predictive because they're so inflated, especially our cohort of applicants. But testing is a more robust indicator of who will do well at our school. So when I look at that study, it's like, okay, that to me confirms that there is something here that's valuable and valid. There's research earlier, Bill Hiss's work, defining promise and those kind of things, and defining access. And they were looking at, a non-elite group of schools. And for them, high school grades were much more predictive, but it could be there are different tranches of schools that testing is much more important here than here. And that may be, a way we look at it. Also, for some big state schools, they may find testing to be more helpful, drawing from a much broader applicant pool from all these schools all over their state and beyond, and that having one unified standard helps them pick a better class. So, there's definitely research, but to me, when the school does the research, there is nothing more valuable than that. When they look at their own data, their own student performance, and that's the purest standard, and they're not, they don't have a horse in the race or dog in the fight. Ultimately, they're not the College Board. But they have their internal research department look at the stats and run the regression and say, oh, yeah, it does predict or it doesn't. And then let that inform your decisions. To me, makes all the sense in the world. It's just logical.
Well, so that brings up the question of in those studies, are they able to tell which students have been prepped and which ones haven't? And how does test prep fall into, help with that? Because if I didn't have, as a student, if I didn't have the math or everything to help me be successful at MIT or Caltech, but I ended up with a higher math score, maybe it was because I was prepped, but I don't have the background for it.
I mean, test prep can do some lifting, but it can only do so much. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, test prep does move the needle. But if, you're looking at a low income community and there's a student who, like, the average ACT score in his school is a 17, and this kid out of the gate independently, gets a 29 or something that's like, holy cow, this is a special kid. for a variety of reasons, and the variations, looking at, fairness or genetic differences or whatever it is. This kid is really, really sharp. And this test helped reveal that. And so in terms of, is it just test prep? Because part of it, like the Raj Chetty research with the elite, the IBs Plus, it was testing is predictive at every level of income, at the highest levels and the lowest levels, those who have access to all the test prep in the world and those who have very little access. And in terms of still, it is a strong predictor and a robust predictor of performance in this range, in the middle range of income, and the high ranges. So it's not just those who get prepped and don't get prepped. It's not the people who say this is only a well test. That is just a fallacy. For sure, in America, students who have more wealth tend to do better on a lot of measures. And I mentioned to you earlier on, the pre-call, like, their college essays are dramatically better than those of students who are less affluent. Their activities list is more robust, more impressive than it's wealth moves every needle. And just to isolate and say this is a wealth thing and nothing else is. And that was part of the pushback on the UC system. They were like, no, 7 of these 13 items are, influenced heavily by wealth and resources. And if we're going to reject anything which is moved by wealth, how do we, that's going to limit us dramatically in terms of what we can actually measure versus taking that into account and understanding, yeah, America, there are differences in affluence and differences, some of it's by race, some of it's by class, SES, and understanding that, having a different expectation for a student in this zip code than in this zip code, and being mindful of that, because class is real. And those differences do play out broadly in America and society.
Well, what about for students where maybe English is their second language, either in the US or in another country, like our international students? Are there studies that show the impact on that?
In terms of test prep impacting their performance, or just the impact?
Just take it, in terms of the test itself. And
yeah, the test itself, I mean, you needed the TOEFL to help balance that out. You need some other way to measure, fluency, some other assessment if English isn't their first language, because again, they're going to be at a major disadvantage taking a test that is assuming, the SAT is on an 11th grade reading level and the ACT is on a 9th grade reading level. So if you don't have fluency, if you're coming in at an 8th grade level, you're going to struggle because the College Board throws at you some pretty advanced You're going to be reading, there's Jane Austen, there's Shakespeare. This is pretty advanced stuff. And so it's assuming a level of fluency. And so that's why you have the TOEFL or other, other tests of that kind of nature.
Okay. So now we have this new, in March, there's going to be the new digital SAT. Yeah. How is it going to differ from the traditional one?
It's I would say a dramatic improvement over the current SAT. And it's funny, I've been in this field since 2001, and I watched the test. It changed in '94, it changed in 2005. It keeps evolving, but I really, really like this most recent evolution. As a educational psychologist guy, like when I can take a test that was much longer, that was at one point a 5-hour administration, which I didn't like that. I didn't like when it was 5 hours. When you had the required essay and you had, the full 10th section and all the breaks, and you go in an 8, leave at 1. And that was a problem for a lot of kids. The ability to maintain clarity and focus and attention. There are a lot of kids we work with at Applerouth who have ADHD and attentional issues, and, they're medicine, whatever it is. And the whole thing is, what are you assessing? Are you assessing intellectual cognitive ability? Or are you assessing mental endurance? And what do you really care about, and why? Why are you testing mental endurance? Is that really a predictor of performance in college? And it really shouldn't be. Like when in college do you have to focus for 5 hours straight on one task? Like that isn't a thing in college. Your exams are a couple hours, and if you're writing a paper, you get home, you take breaks, But so I didn't like when the test was so long. This test goes down to testing content of 2 hours and 14 minutes, which is amazing, and kids love that. And as an educator, I'm celebrating, getting a test that is much more efficient, down to 94 items, down to, from 150. The ACTS, I think 215. It's a much bigger, broader assessment, because when you go from classical testing to adaptive testing to item response theory testing, you're getting rid of all these items that really weren't functional performing items. Because someone who's, going for a 750 on math, do you have to ask them basic, algebra, basic? Like, no, they're going to crush those questions are wasted on them. In a similar fashion, a student who's going to end up with a score in, 450s on math, asking them the most advanced graphing questions, they're not going to get those right. It would be extremely unlikely. Why don't we tailor the test to questions that are more appropriate for their level? And so I've always liked, for 25 years, 97, 98, that's when you had the GRE and the GMAT going adaptive. They were able to, give students items that were more, appropriate for them, and therefore have a shorter test. And so classical theory is I have to ask questions to help me discriminate between a 350 and 370 SAT, and also questions that discriminate between a 1570, 1580. And so I have to ask a whole lot of questions, which are, the lower end of kids, they're lost in the high questions, and the high kids are just blowing through all the easy questions. And so adaptive testing helps me truncate it. I ask far fewer questions. They are calibrated and picked for the high-end students, low-end students, and therefore they're not, the low-end students aren't getting questions that are blowing their minds, and the really bright kids who are blowing through aren't having all these boring questions that are just not meaningful for them. And so it's more efficient. I love that. And it's also, they were able to reduce the number of items so much that they've drastically increased the amount of time per question. And that is a big, big change. So kids are walking out, you have 60% more time per question on the SAT compared now to the ACT. That's a whole accommodation. That is, you're getting time and a half and then some on the SAT compared to the ACT, because they were able to whittle down the number of questions. They're also doing a thing there with item response theory, it's item response scoring, where each item is getting individually weighted. It's algorithmic scoring. So it's not like before, it was always every question is one raw point, and one raw point scales to, the scale. That isn't the way it's done anymore. Now, this question could count more than that question, because they've done some pre-testing. They found that students who get this question right also get these 3 questions right. Therefore, let's just weight this one more heavily and not ask the other 3. So it's also one of the ways they're getting more efficient. So it's a streamlined test. It's more efficient. It's shorter. The kids have more time per question. You have all these great built-in tools like the Desmos calculator, which is very, very powerful if you know how to use it. And one of the reasons I like it is because our kids like it. And it's new for America in March, but also we had, over 1.5 million kids take this thing in October. And we've been working internationally since March of last year. So we've already had 5 administrations, and we've worked with hundreds and hundreds of students across the world. And the feedback is it went well. And you know what? I prefer this to the old one. So to me, I'm listening to there are some kids who like the ability to write on the test. That's something that you do lose. And I remember that when I was working with kids on the GRE and the GMAT, 20 years ago, they were able to learn how to take notes on their own paper. And it's nice writing on the booklet, but you can learn how to do it on the paper, or like for the GRE, it was on the little dry erase board they gave you, and how to really fine tune and hone. So grand scheme, I see very little that we're losing except for the ability to write on the test. I love that it's shorter, and kids have more time per question. Great for our kids with disabilities, great. And also it's phenomenal for anyone who has a disability, because the accommodations are built in. You're not relying upon the proctor to give you anything. Even time and a half is just baked in and starts with time and a half or double time. Extra breaks. I mean, if you need a text-to-screen reader, you bring your headphones, and you're not ever relying again on a person to read to you. It's all right there. You can change the font real time. You can apply a filter if you have dyslexia. Like, everything is baked into the software, which is so much better. So I think it's better for so many kinds of kids.
So, well, that brings up a lot of different questions. But first of all, let's go to Shannon says it's great to have the calculator if you know how to use it. What does that mean?
So Desmos is one of the most popular calculators in like public high schools and private high schools in the country. It's used, if you ask kids who knows Desmos, half of them raise their hand. For chemistry, other classes, it's a very powerful graphing calculator tool. You can go online, desmos.com, but I asked one of my students who I coach for executive functioning, so how was the PSAT? And I'm like, oh, how was Desmos? He's like, I didn't even open the calculator. I was like, Daniel, you didn't use Desmos? He's like, yeah, I didn't need it or didn't know how to use it. But it is such a powerful tool that if you know how to use it, there's so much of the math on the SAT is algebra and graphing and function notation, and trying to find intercepts and things. So if you know how to use the calculator, you can solve things in all these different ways and really efficient ways. Like some of there, I could solve it brute force this way, or I could plug the graph in, find the thing, measure the distance, and boom, I've solved it in 20 seconds versus a minute and a half. So there are ways of learning how to use this calculator. And again, it's not like, these secret tips or tricks, but it's just learning how to use this tool. And I feel like whenever we work with kids, we teach them, here's this powerful, powerful tool that's baked in. It's free for every student. Some of them used to, bring in bad calculators. Now they have this best-in-class graphing calculator for all students on every section of math. But you have to spend a little time to make sure, maybe someone taught you in your high school. If they didn't, here's a tutorial. Let's go and practice them on the desmos.com website, but learn how to use this powerful tool.
But does College Board put on their website, here, bring this calculator, this is the best in class, you can use this in—
Well, Desmos, all you do, like when you're in the math section, there's a little calculator icon. If I press it, Desmos opens up, and I can move it around, and it's baked into the test now.
Oh
So
my goodness.
College Board has licensed that technology from Desmos. So it's not the full scale scientific calculator. It's reduced because you don't need all these crazy function things. It's more algebra and the basic graphing functions, but really powerful. And some kids, we say, bring your TI, which is great for doing averages or finding the mean or median. But when it comes to doing graphing, Desmos is best in class.
So being able to have, and I think that shows the shift that has been, because in the past, that would have been considered cheating. You're supposed to do that all in your head. And now
we live in a world where everybody has a supercomputer in their pocket.
Yes.
And so, it was interesting. In 2016, they made a move toward the Common Core, towards like more mental math. And there was a whole section with no calculator. And I feel like in this world, that's just, it's like, orienteering. Now we have Google Maps. And, the ability to find directions. Now we have outsourced that skill to this part of our frontal cortex. It's right here. But we live in a world where we always have the calculator. So the ability to do long division without a calculator, is that really a useful tool anymore in the same way that it used to be? Now that everyone has a computer in their hand. So I feel like the ability to use a tool is more of an important, the same thing as the AP exams. It used to be about brute memorization. And I memorized so much content. Now it's like, no, that we live in an open book world where everybody has a supercomputer, again, which has all the world's knowledge right here. Me memorizing this string of names and dates is less meaningful than, can I manipulate, can I read, can I, tease out insights, versus I've memorized names and dates. So I think it really is a shift in what do you need to succeed in this coming, in the world.
I remember when you had to study for SAT words and do analogies and
there was
all
a lot.
That.
And I used to love my flashcards. They were really smart and fun, but got rid of those when the vocabulary went away from the SAT in that regard.
Yeah. So Ronke says, my son, who is a junior, says Desmos is a lifesaver.
Yeah.
He went on to say you should almost not get anything wrong if you know how to use it.
At least half the items on the if you know how to use Desmos, you could solve them. And so it's a powerful tool, and it's available to everybody for free. So that to me is very democratic and very positive.
So that would be part of the test prep then, is helping them understand.
You have to learn how to use this tool. Yeah, for sure. That's part of, at least spend a couple hours learning Desmos. If you're going to go in there and take this test, that is part and parcel now of math test prep for sure.
So Elizabeth says that this is in the question. I'm sure you're aware of the data-driven counter arguments, like from John Beckenstadt, and so he has,
John doesn't love the SAT. Bill Hiss, there's a camp of people who are very averse to admissions testing. John, and for sure, Bob Schaefer and friends, they're part of a cohort. And there's been a big drumbeat of late of testing is bad. And testing contributes nothing. It's worthless. Some people, testing has a racial, versus people who are looking from the school side, and they're cautious. And that's something, I pulled up a quote for you a minute ago. Again, it's from their own institutions. And it was the quote from Paxton, I think. It was Sheena Paxton said, standardized testing has been criticized as an inaccurate predictor of student success, yet data show that these tests do reveal useful information, especially, at Brown. Test scores, quote, are a much better predictor of academic success than high school grades, which are exceptional and increasingly subject to grade inflation. So part of it people like, Bob and John and Bill Hiss, they're grade, grade, grade. But part of it over the years, this was part of the UC research, grades have been so inflated and there's so
Mhm.
much grade compression that there are weaker and weaker signal of academic readiness because there's so much inflation and it's all game theory and competitive dynamics, and teachers, administrators, they're giving their kids higher grades because it helps them in this competitive game of admissions. But those grades are just less of a strong predictor. And that's part of the whole thing of like a student has a 94 on calculus, then goes and gets a 1 on the AP Calc exam. And so it's like, how much do you actually know? You have a 94 in the class. And this I've heard from, an admissions officer at a very elite school. It's like when I actually saw the AP scores, I was like, you kind of cringe. Because when it comes to objective knowledge, like what's your level of mastery, grades don't always communicate level of mastery. And also, there are 30,000 high schools, and there are different standards for grading. Some schools grading has to do with your level of showing up and motivation and your attitude versus no, have you mastered this skill? Are you ready for a more advanced class? And different teachers have different ways of different philosophies about what grades connote and mean. And I was talking with one of my good friends this morning. We went for a little hike with our dogs, and his daughter got a 99 in English. And he said, she's smart and decent writer, but 99 leaves nowhere else to go. Like, and I know for like back when we were in that school, we would, work our tails off, for a low 90. And there was always room for excellence, but like there has been pressure at the high school level for teachers to give higher grades. And I'm friendly with some of my old high school teachers, and some of them were called out by their headmasters for you're giving 91s, but across the street they're giving 97s. You've got to give higher grades, or our kids are going to be at a disadvantage in terms of admissions. And there's been all that kind of, and parents getting super involved, administrators. So its grades are just different than they were 30 years ago. And because of that, they're a weaker signal than they were 30 years ago in terms of who's ready and who will do really well in college and beyond. And that was all the research, from, and especially at these elite schools where everyone has very high grades. I heard someone say, well, what kind of A's? Like, my kid has all A's applying to Georgia Tech. They're like, well, what kind of A's? And also in what classes? And then also what else? Because there's a lot of a strong, having lots of A's is less exceptional than it was 30 years ago when
Right,
I was applying to school.
right,
And
right.
so it's a different time, honestly.
That's true. That's very true. Um, so let's see. Is the question is on the digital SAT, let's see, does it, so on the practice DSAT, does it include calculator?
The digital SAT does include a calculator,
But what about a
always
practice version?
in both sections. And this is, I'm gonna step back for a second. Like people like John Beckenstadt, I respect him.
Mhm.
He's a research, a smart guy, and I've heard him speak many times. And but I think what it's teasing out is he's looking at massive data sets. Bill Hiss had a small focus. This Raj Chetty and group, they looked at 12 schools, and it seems like we're getting mixed messages. And different data sets are yielding different answers. And that leads me to believe there's not one answer. That if I, again, there's like sampling and not sampling error, but if I look at this group, it'll tell me this answer. And that's where I believe that there's real value in doing school by school. And that's something where when MIT, with I believe it was Stuart Schmill, is like in our research, I'm quoting him. In most cases, we cannot reliably predict students will do well at MIT unless we consider standardized tests alongside grades, coursework, and other factors. These findings are statistically they're robust and stable over time, and they hold when you control for socioeconomic factors and look across demographic groups. And the math component of testing is the most important. That was Stuart Schmill from the Dean of Admissions at MIT. So again, am I going to discount, and I remember Akil Bello wrote back and said, hey, we don't listen to MIT. But no, like to me, MIT, they can do their stats. It's a very basic, I did my graduate research work on it. This is simple stats, simple regression. And it's not complicated, looking for, the B, the beta, the value of the prediction. And every school has to do their research. And so Yale, do yours. MIT, do yours. Purdue, UGA, UNC, Texas, every school, do your research, run the regression, and let that inform you. Versus, again, if you look at, the research from Raj Chetty, testing is very important for this group. The research for, Bill Hiss, testing is less important for this group. For Beckenstat, so I feel like listen to your institutional research, your data, your statisticians, and what they tell you, let that be your guide. because it may be there really is like a challenging factor that testing is really important up here and less so down here. In which case, Valdosta State testing shouldn't be a factor. At Tufts or at Bryn Mawr, testing really should be a factor. But listen, look at your own data. Well, that to me is really important.
Well, so, and that's true. I think too, from my perspective as a counselor, what I've run into is the whole psychology behind it as well. And testing incurs a lot of anxiety and angst for a lot of students and for parents. And having test optional, especially since I'm in California, having that option of should I take the test or not has created an opportunity for students to really make that decision from a personal perspective rather than, oh, I've got to take this test for the schools. So that's one aspect.
Yeah.
But the other thing that I've noticed, again, from a California is before, if you want to go to a University of California, whether it was UCLA or UC Merced, which is near where I live, you had to take the test.
Right.
Now, and so you had much more of a bell curve. But now, for many of these campuses, private or out of state, you're only taking the test if you're going to score really, really high.
That's right.
And if you don't score high, then you're just not going to share your test scores.
Yeah.
So it seems like that has skewed that the data and what's going on in test admission. I mean,
test optional may be worse than test required or test blind. And because again, it creates more confusion. It creates, I think in a world where, testing is part and parcel of, it's a requirement, you have to do it. But there's always a question now, do I send this score? Do I not send the score? Will the score help me or hurt me? There's a whole different level of calculus now that wasn't there before. Before it was you get your score, you send your score.
Right.
Do I think test optional has helped certain people who have high test anxiety? Yeah, I do. And I know people who did extremely well, some of my peers who would have gone to different colleges because they had phenomenal grades, great rigor, but their testing was really, really, really soft. And in this world, they could have gotten into those better schools. And I know that. And so I feel like for them, that would have changed their lives, in the grand scheme. But honestly, when it comes to test anxiety, at some point in your life, there's going to be some kind of assessment. Like people who have, performance anxiety, test anxiety, at some point, whether it's grad school, whether it's some kind of professional assessment, a Series 7 exam, the medical boards, many people in many fields, they're going to face an assessment at some point. And learning how to self-regulate, learning how to manage anxiety, or having a big job interview or a big performance, there's something where I'm going to have to produce and perform and not, have this massive, like fear event, anxiety event. And so I think at some point you're going to have to deal with this in your life event, unless there are professions where there aren't any kind of, performative tasks, but in many there are. And I, as a counselor, to get certified, I had to pass a test to be nationally certified. That was part of my counselor certification. And if I have massive anxiety, it's like I have to learn how to deal with that if I want to be a counselor or a psychologist or whatever, other things. So in the grand scheme, I feel, and that was part of the Bill Hiss's research, that the people who, they test optional, the non-submitters were grad school challenged. The ones who did not send test scores to the Bill Hayes, were the ones that had much lower outcomes in grad school than those who sent test scores for a number of, for a lot of reasons. So I think part of it is overcoming the hurdle, learning the skill. There may be other confounds in terms of levels of affluence, other things in that mix. It wasn't a pure, study in that regard. But I saw that test submitters had like 3x, like their grad school attendance was much higher than non-submitters, which is interesting. Now that got my attention. So I don't know. I feel like, is having a test. There are many countries who have a test. Many, Western nations, they do have an assessment for education, for whether it's your A levels or the CAST, South Korea or the Gaokao. There's going to be, India. Most countries do have an assessment, and whether you see it as meritocratic or people with test prep. But that's one thing also, like in New York, with the specialized high school, the SHSAT, there are students, and some of them who are not very affluent, but they really work hard on this test. And you go to Stuyvesant or Bronx Science, there's a lot of first-gen kids who work their tail off, and they found their way into these great schools, and it's going to change their lives. And so that's something where, is that meritocratic or it's, I don't know. I feel like having an assessment everyone takes at some point it is a leveler. And it can be depending upon your perspective, whether, de Blasio and Bloomberg had very different perspectives on this, ultimately. But I do feel like I'm a pro testing guy. So when you talk to me, you have to know where I come from. And I
Right.
like objective measurement. And I always look at anything subjective as subject prone to game theory and competitive dynamics and prisoner's dilemma. If we don't inflate and they inflate, our kids get hurt, let's inflate. And I look at, the quadrants, let's give them, and so I don't always trust, motivations and incentives when they're kind of perversely aligned. And that's one of the reasons when there's no one refereeing why we keep seeing grades going up and up and up. There's no Jerome Powell. There's no one saying there's too much inflation. We got to curb this. It's just let individually, it serves me if I inflate my kids' grades,
Uh-huh.
but not the whole system. And that's kind of the tragedy of the commons. But it's something where we're all looking out for our personal interests. But I feel like standardized testing is a ballast. It's kind of a way, it's an anchor that I can inflate grades all I want, but I know this thing is a measurement of me versus everyone in the country, and my teachers at my school can't do this for me. But that's where I do like, and I mentioned earlier with the NCAA, getting rid of the eligibility requirement. I don't like that because we've worked with Applerouth 50,000 plus students and many Div 1 athletes, recruited athletes. And some of them came to us. I mentioned to you earlier, their grades were okay, passable on the NCAA matrix, but they could barely read. Their literacy was so low. And that's why they came to us. They scored a 630 on the SAT, and they weren't going to be able to play Div 1 ball. And we worked with them, we trained them, we taught them reading skills and grammar skills. But like once you get rid of that requirement, it's like the gloves are off. Now, as long as if they're winning on Friday night and they're winning games for the high school, their teachers have a massive incentive to keep passing them on. And so will the colleges. And then they're going to end up with, they'll graduate if they don't go to the NFL or the NBA, and they can barely read. And I don't like that. I mean, I like some measure of accountability. I feel like testing gives you some objective measurement, which I think in this world there's a place for it.
Mhm. Well, yeah, and yeah, it's finding that balance and all the different um types of students
Yeah.
and as you said, it's a standardized thing. But you know, I know from the area I'm in, I've seen a lot of differences and because the students in this area don't have they're not, test prep is not a big factor for them. I see their scores are typically much lower than what the normal college going student is at a much more competitive high school because they're all Title I schools, so they're not highly competitive. So there's a couple other things about the verbal portion for the new SAT. It's Ronke says that it looks like the verbal portion relies more on knowing those SAT words.
Oh, absolutely
More
not. The opposite.
vocabulary.
The
And
opposite.
especially and Diana talks about it, she's in Columbia, that there's a
So,
students that need to know those
you
words.
never have to memorize vocabulary words ever again for the SAT. You there, okay. Like
How
the
does that
old
work?
SAT, the one I took in 93, it had antonyms, it had analogies, it had
Mhm.
sentence completions, and there were four elements. Half the test was vocabulary, and that world is gone. And with the 2016 iteration, they got rid of the antonyms and the analogies. But what they've done, they have increased the level of the reading level for the vocabulary passages. They're not going to brute force ask you, what does the word epiphany mean? They're not going to ask you, what does clandestine mean? Of the words that used to be assessed on these really high, like rarely occurring words that were smart words. Those are gone. But they're giving you a sonnet by Shakespeare. And they're giving, so again, I can't memorize a certain level, but they're giving me a passage. It could be from Milton. It could be something that's really advanced. They're not asking me about, any one word, but they are asking me something about comprehension. They're asking me, do I have an understanding of the author's tone in this little passage, or something? But it's not a brute force question. They ask you vocab in context, but it's going to be a word that's fairly simple, which may have two meanings. Like the word defend most nearly means blank or blank or blank, and so it could be defend means this or defend means that. They aren't asking you, the word salubrious most nearly means. You're not going to have kids ever memorizing vocab words, but they do have to read at an 11th grade level if they're going to be. And so that's one thing where the ACT operates at a ninth grade level of reading. And so, from our past analysis, using the Flesch-Kincaid assessment of vocab level and sentence length and complexity. So it seems like, yeah, you do have to read at a higher level for the College Boards test. They also give you more time. If you're a slower reader, again, you have you have a lot longer per question than you do on the ACT, which is much speedier and much faster. But so advanced passages, but no direct vocab kind of questions in that regard.
So then how do you help prepare students for that?
We teach them reading skills. We go through so it's the verbal section is they're smashing together the writing, the grammar, the mechanics, and then also the reading skills and how to do inferences, how to read. What we teach them is how to read critically. And now it's all just one short passage. It's one, like 6, 7 lines. Next question, a whole new passage. There's no more reading a 90 line text anymore. So we teach them how to read it, how to read carefully the question, how to make sure they're understanding what they're asking for, and then also how to parse it. One thing I've taught for 20 years is, they give you A, B, C, D, and how do I identify what makes A wrong? What word in A, what word is an assumption? What word is a reach? Or you're confusing this for this? So they really get clear. And, then you're down between C and D, and of the two, D is better and why. So we're teaching them how to think. It's a certain kind of logic for answering a question. And am I reading closely and am I adhering to the words? It's very much a word level focus. And again, kids in a hurry, they'll make a mistake or they'll assume this means this, or like, no, this word is wrong because of that. So it's showing them a certain kind of reasoning. It really is about, evidence and critical reasoning. And it's a kind of a deep level of reading, which we do teach. And don't be in a hurry, because if you're in a hurry, you're going to choose C, and C is wrong, and here's why it's wrong.
Well, and I think that would reduce anxiety if you know how to approach it. Like if I, as a student, come in and take it and just like, I have no idea what to do or how to do this. And if once you're taught those skills, then that relieves a lot of the test anxiety and stress.
Yeah. When you build mastery, and they have mastery experiences when they have experienced themselves being effective, like, Bandura's whole theory of self-efficacy. If I can give them some success, then their anxiety is going to drop. And so that's where it's like when they begin to realize, oh, wow, I apply these things, these skills, I get the right answer, I feel better, I feel like I'm not lost in the woods. And you feel anxious when you feel not up to the task. When you have low self-efficacy, like, I don't know if I can do this, you're nervous. But when you have demonstrated, I can do, that's one of the beauties of test prep, and we're building the sense of self-efficacy over time.
Yeah. And that's why in our AVID programs, we, starting as early as 7th or 8th grade, we did test prep to just help build that confidence,
practice
and
tests,
exposure, and
exposure.
just, and build that mastery.
Yeah.
So 2 other questions. So first of all, somebody asked, the individual college's preference to see test or not is not in the common data set. Is that correct? How do you know whether that's
it's interesting. Okay, so it's very clear. You have 84 schools that are test blind, test free. They don't take tests. Half of them are in California where you are, and then you have a smattering of other ones here and there, Worcester Poly or other places, or St. Mary, so or Catholic. Apart from test blind, test free, then you have the small handful of tests required, the Florida, the Tennessee, UGA, like MIT, Georgetown. Then you have this massive world of optional. And there are some, like Auburn is test conditional, that if I have under, a 3.6 or over, test optional, 3.6 or below, test required. And we may see more of that. But everybody else, you have, 1,800 schools, you have this mass number of schools who are test optional. Within that cohort, there are some who like to see tests and they prefer to see tests, but that is by no means indicated in the common data set. And sometimes it's not even indicated on their websites. It's captured in conversations, quotes from the admissions officers or heads of these admission. And it's like, yeah, we'd love to see this, but it's like, whoa. So, and then the other way it's captured, sometimes we get data showing these massive differentials in terms of admission rates. That's
Mhm.
like for geez, Boston College. Gee, BC is crazy. BC, it's almost 3-1. The kids getting in with test scores, without test scores. And it's like
Mhm.
clearly that admissions office, they are test optional, read it on the CDS, bam. But when you're getting in 3-1 with test scores, I want to know that if I were a student. Then it'll probably help my cause having a good test score if I'm applying to BC. And seeing, the rates of admission getting into Notre Dame on 2-1, UVA. Like there are a lot of colleges where there is a real advantage. Again, they don't publish that. It's not captured in the CDS. There are times we've captured that from a press release or something that was momentarily up on a blog. But there's no one capturing that in any kind of systematic way. So it is tough and tricky to try to figure out, do these guys prefer tests a little bit, or they're really open? Because there are definitely admissions offices where they do not prefer tests, where they are really agnostic. If you have testing, okay, it's maybe a slight plus factor. Then there are schools where it's, holy cow, this makes a big difference if you have a good test score, depending upon, which school you go to and so forth. So my rule of thumb is looking at the percentage of students who submit test scores. That's probably an indicator, one, of the quality and strength of the school. But when a lot of kids are sending test scores, my assumption is test scores may matter more. Again, that may not always hold logically, but I do look at, the schools who have the highest rates of test submission are more selective. And my assumption is when you have, because again, those schools are getting more applications. They're getting more applicants who have really strong GPAs, and they're trying to find, ways to differentiate among strong applicants. So testing can be one way to stand out. And all these quotes from Dartmouth and from MIT and from Yale, and it's Brown. It seems like when they're getting lots, and the Raj Chetty's research, when you're having lots of kids applying with strong GPAs, test scores matter a little bit more because there's so much grade compression and inflation in that pool of kids.
Mhm.
So I think when you're applying to schools that are more selective, typically test scores have a greater impact than the much lower level schools. In my experience, in my estimation, if I were giving a counsel to a parent, and I wish there was a way to show that, this school, this test preferred, but often that's not top line on a school's website.
Yeah.
It's tricky.
And so, well, and that's the question. What other schools favor sending tests besides BC? Is there a list or a place to go, or do we just have to, like, I think Jenny and Jeff do some of that in some of their research. If somebody wants to pull that up, I know there's some data that they use, but
I always present a little bit of data, the test scores and the admit rates.
Mhm.
And there are definitely some schools
Yeah, you do.
where, it seems like with BC and Emory and Colgate and Davidson and Notre Dame and Amherst and, University of Virginia and Wellesley, where it seems like there's a really meaningful differential between the kids who get in with test scores and without. And it's interesting. The schools, for a minute, they published that data in like 2021 and 2022. Schools have been much less forthcoming with that data. And because part of it is their mission is to generate as many applications as they possibly can. And it actually doesn't serve their interests. Maybe they were, for transparency, but no, there's no one holding them to that transparency, and it actually hurts them if kids with low test scores don't apply.
Mhm.
And so, or if kids who just withhold their applications because they want to generate as many applications. So they want to tell kids, everybody apply, it's the even playing field, even if internally they prefer test scores. That's just not often public knowledge.
Mhm. And can you send a link or post a link to what, the
So I
article or
could,
thing that,
okay, that's a one of my slides on one of my decks. I'll
okay, so you'll send
copy.
it to me later.
Yeah, and this is like gathered from press releases and looking at their websites and different blogs and things.
Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. Perfect. Well, there's there's so many other things to talk about, but we're getting really short on time here. So a couple of things I want to address. So Paul asked that looks like there's substantial advantage to being very familiar with Desmos. Is there any like resource or things which what extent has which Desmos reached under-resourced high schools? Are
I
there
mean, if
any
you have an
ways?
internet connection, you go to desmos.com and you practice with it and play with it. Khan Academy has free resources for, teaching kids some Desmos skills
Okay.
and just practicing. I guess for us, we have, a guide, but it's,
Hmm.
we're a paid test prep company. But
Hmm.
there definitely are free resources out there for kids. practice. And I would first go to desmos.com and do some of their primers and learn how to use their tool.
Okay, but the school, yeah, and then that goes back to, like, a lot of times I know the schools recommend students go to Khan Academy and do their test prep, and so if they can find that there, they'll be able to find that. But you have to have that understanding and
It helps. I mean,
first
you can do it
step.
without it, but it helps.
Mhm. Also, one commenter on test prep, this is from Paul again, has speculated there's a non-transparent score ceiling for those people who missed the difficult level questions on the digital SATs
It's about
first
660.
section.
Yeah. So the test is adaptive. And so everyone has the same baseline module. And if I get 2/3 right, I go to the more advanced module and my score, and then there's the lower module, which is easier. And essentially between 440 and like 650, you could be in either module. But if I'm under 440, I'm in the low module. If I'm over 660, I'm in the high module. That's from the test we've analyzed so far on the College Board's given us. So if I got a 700, I went to the hard module. If I got a 550, I have no idea. I could have gone to the hard module and done that as well, or I went to the easy one and did very well. But the College Board never tells you. There's no indication on your score report. It's just, but if I get a 680, I went to the hard module. That's the only way, to tell.
So do you think eventually they might be pushed to reveal that as part of?
No, I don't. I mean,
Okay.
there's a lot less transparency in the scoring because again, different items have different weights. It's algorithmic scoring. It's different. And there are different, weights based on which module I get into, the upper or lower module. So one of the reasons the score report has almost no information anymore is because they don't want kids to go and get so upset of, hey, I got 33 right and I got a 650. And this other kid says, well, I got 27 right and I got a 7, like things are screwy now because it's not the number right that matters. It's which items I got right and on which section. And so I got one right that counted a lot. You got one right that counted less. And therefore I can get fewer right and have a higher scaled score, which is very different than the past. And so that's why there's so much less transparency and they don't even tell you which module. And they don't want kids to stress too much. The main thing is do your best in every question. And there's no way to game it that fails. You have to just do your best. And if I can get 2/3 right on the baseline section, I'm going hard. And if I go under that, I'm going to the easy one. And then do your best everywhere you go. It happens, immediately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And the whole paradigm and the whole mindset has to shift. The paradigm has shifted. So the mindset has to shift with it too.
And the trade-off, part of it, understanding the trade-off is I get a shorter test. I get more time per question. And with that, I get less transparency with my scoring. And so would I take, do I want a longer test and a faster test for more transparency? Or am I willing to take a short test with more time and less transparency? That to me, I think it's worth the trade-off.
So, and again, so I'm going to add 2 questions and to wind this up. Lisa says, I've found that test prep quality depends on the tutor.
Sure.
Do you have a system you train your tutors to follow?
Absolutely. Yeah, we spent years building a curriculum and a method and comprehensive materials, both our books and our online practice so yeah, we have a system, we do trainings, we do quality control, we oversee our tutors for sure. But even within that, I mean, the same as, at a law firm, you have there's levels of quality, even at really great law firms and levels. And so we have certain tutors who've been working with us for 15 years. You can't, but I think on average, we have 2 tiers of our, more advanced tutors and our base. We do our base level tutor, they're very well trained. I think they're very, very strong. But yeah, if I were to pick tutors for my own students, I would know which ones. If we have 220 tutors, I'd like Tom to teach my daughter just because I know he's had 500 kids. But typically you're right. There's a range of quality always, but I think we try to maintain a floor that's pretty high.
Yeah. Well, so as counselors and advisors, when we're offering that test prep, then that's something that we focus on and make a core part of it. Or, we find out when we refer people. I have never been a test prep person. I've never been interested in doing that whatsoever. I'm a terrible test taker, and so I'm on that other range. But I've always tried to send my students to quality prep. So my last question, Jed, is, you've talked a little bit about how to prep for the verbal side. How do you prep students for the math side? That's the other big question. Is like, is this a preppable, is this a
And
coachable
every
test?
test is preppable. There is not a test in the world. An IQ test is preppable. I could do a Rorschach and prep you on the rubric. Every test imaginable can be prepped once you know how it's being scored, and from a psychological perspective. So I think for this test, yeah, there are ways of preparing yourself. The world of the SAT is actually relatively narrow. There's so much more content on the ACT in terms of they do more advanced conic sections and ellipses. They do matrices, they do logarithm, all this advanced math you don't ever see on the SAT. It really is this narrow focus on algebra, algebra 1, algebra 2, function notation, equation systems, graphing. And if I can, work in this narrow world of exponents and understand how they work, I can do very well. So I feel like they've narrowed the focus, and you can, work with the tutor and go on the College Board and Khan Academy and just keep hitting the core skills, and you can get really strong and really good, and also learn the tools. So I think the world was much broader years ago, and there was like SAT math, things that only existed on the SAT. All that's gone. Now it really is, it's tailored to the curriculum in a fairly narrow subset, which ends around 10th, 11th grade of that math. And for many kids, it's 10th grade math. That's where it finishes. No calculus, no advanced, very, very, very light trig, like 1 or 2 trig questions. That are pretty basic, sine, cosine, so SOHCAHTOA, or a basic, sine curve. So grand scheme, you can learn the math, I'd say relatively easily, and even the verbal. I mean, I feel like this test is very much preppable again, but as every test can be prepped. That's part of just my belief as an educator.
Mm-hmm.
I can't imagine making a test that someone couldn't prepare for. What that even look like if they knew how it was being scored.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's a very good closing comment. And there's other comments. If people have other questions, how can they reach you or your office?
Info at Applerouth, just basic info at Applerouth. And our website. And if you want, like, I have a newsletter coming out Tuesday. I wrote an article about grade inflation, and I mentioned the Raj Chetty research and some of the other stuff that's been posted recently. And so we'll have a new blog post coming out Tuesday. We have a thing called The Slice. But yeah, info at Applerouth. Reach out to us. We're happy to talk about any of this stuff.
So that sounds great. And you brought up a topic, the whole SAT versus ACT. That's a whole nother topic.
That's a
we
different
can spend
world.
a whole nother hour on.
Call me back
Some
and do it
people
again.
are just doing the ACT because they're not sure how the SAT, rollout's going to be and such. So,
and they're both good tests for different kids. They really are.
Yeah. Jed, thank you again so much. And thank you everyone for being here today. I know we went a little long, but this is such important information. And my goal is to give you guys all the information so that you can make decisions and apply it to the students and the community that you serve. And Jed, I know you've always had that at front of mind for what you do and the contributions you've made. So thank you again for being here.
My pleasure.
Everyone, next week we're going to talk about branding and brand stories. I have 2 marketing people. You don't want to miss that. And Jed, may I tell you that I think you're the new website. I don't know how long you've had this one up, but
You like it?
I love it. I think
Awesome.
It's a great example. I showed it to the marketing team last week and they said, this is exactly. So if you guys want kind of a highlight of what we're going to talk about next week, go to applerouth.com and I'd love to hear your thoughts. So thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend, Jed and everyone else. And I'll be back here next Friday.